Welcome to In the Spotlight. I'm Abigail Pogrebin. Ilana Kaufman is the Chief Executive Officer of the Jews of Color Initiative. Her work sits at the center of Jewish community, racial equity, and justice, and is anchored by the voices and experiences of Jews of color. Ilana has been featured on NPR's All Things Considered and Code Switch, The Forward, E-Jewish Philanthropy, and her Eli Talk titled Who Counts? Race and the Jewish Future. It has over 45,000 views, and if you've never watched it, you are late to this party. Don't miss it. She is passionate about the intersection of Jewish community, racial justice, Jews of color, education, and philanthropy. And she's a senior Schusterman Fellow. Welcome, Ilana, to the broadcast. It's great to have you.
My pleasure. It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
I know we're on different coasts, but you know we're bridging the gap with technology.
That's right. That's right.
So, unfortunately, some people don't know about the Jews of Color Initiative, and I know it's sometimes can feel dull to start with the summary of an institution or an organization, but this is such an important one. So, if you wouldn't mind catching us up.
Of course. Thank you so much. The Jews of Color Initiative was founded around 2017, and we were founded with the purpose of helping to build some infrastructure and some landscape, if you will, not only for Jews of color, but our multiracial families in the whole Jewish community. Depending on the age group that you're looking at, somewhere between 15 and 20%, or 8 if you're looking at our elders, 15 in our middle ages, and 20 in our youngest, a percent of our community are Jewish people of color. That means somewhere around 1 million of the United States, 7.2 million Jews self-identify as being both Jewish and people of color, and between 20 and 25% of our families identify as multiracial. And these numbers get bigger every day. And the Jewish community has always been multiracial because of immigration, because different social factors. The U.S. Jewish community has largely expressed as white and Ashkenazi, or being perceived as white, and we might get into that today. And the Jews of Color Initiative is here to bridge the gap and bridge the divide, center the voices and experiences of Jews of color, support leadership development, identity development, program development, and we do that through grant making, we do that through research, and we do that through community education.
That's a very efficient and interesting summary. I want to go back to the numbers because it won't surprise you that there are many in the Jewish community that are surprised that the numbers are that large and don't necessarily know how you're defining Jews of color when you say there are that many.
That's right.
Help us just kind of like understand when you say that, where is that data coming from and who are we talking about?
I love your question because I also grew up thinking I was unique among my own community. I grew up in San Francisco, California, and in one of the oldest synagogues on the West Coast. We had about 2,000 congregants, and 5 of us were people of color. And so I thought that I was among a micro minority of minorities until I really understood the larger context. If you look at our own data at the Jews of Color Initiative, if you look at Pew, if you look at a number of studies, and they're available on our website, you'll see that depending on the age bracket, between 80 and 20% of the U.S. Jewish community self-identifies as people of color. The definition, and we at the Jews of Color Initiative, we don't have a definition for Jews of color. We use what we call a conceptual framework. First of all, everybody gets to self-identify racially however they want. And in the United States, race is a defining identity, and policies, practices, social physics are all informed by the concept of race. So at the JOCI, as we like to call ourselves, we think about race in a couple of ways. One is we use the U.S. Census structures to help frame out how we think about who a person of color is. And we do that so that we can have parallel structures with other conversations around race and racism in the United States. So we think about people who self-identify as Black, Asian, Latino, Latina, Latinx, multiracial, Native Indigenous. And then we think about the US Census and where it falls short. And for Jewish Americans, it falls short because it classifies those who are from the Middle East or North Africa as white. And so in our framework, folks can self-identify into the concept of being a Jewish person of color if they have the life experience and the lived experience of being racialized in the United States and being perceived as and living as a person of color, and they self-identify as Jewish. And that's where we get these numbers of around 1 million of the 7 million Jews in the United States identifying as people of color.
In one interview, you said that you were loath to define Jews of color. And
that's right.
I just want to understand why. Like, is it because it's oversimplified? Is it because it's reductive in some way?
It's oversimplified, it's reductive, and it also it comes from racializing people in the United States and then stratifying us based on our race, and then creating social situations for us and economic situations based on our race. And what I mean by that is this: race is an invented social construct, and we know that. And so we've taken these concepts that are actually flexible and fungible and made them concrete in the United States. And then we assign power and privilege and opportunities to those fabricated concepts. You look at housing policies in the United States and redlining. You look at anti-Semitism in the United States and creating barriers for Jewish people to go to colleges. When Ashkenazi Jews came to the United States, the community was not classified as white. And so these ideas of who is a person of color and who is white are flexible based on social stratification. Mm. The other piece I want to say about that is, as people of color, just the language and the concept itself means that we are of color in relation to whiteness. Mm. If you're of color, that means you're comparing yourself against a standard. And the standard in the United States of whiteness is also a result of racism. White is a social construct, and whiteness flattens European identity too. It's not as if people from Finland and Romania are the same, yet somehow they're grouped into the same category.
So we feel, just so I understand, and I'm hearing you, when what would you advise for those who feel kind of stuck on language, like they don't want to get it wrong?
Right.
Are you comfortable with being called a Black Jew? Is even pairing any kind of label problematic?
I think having understandings of how labels result in social inequity and social injustice is really important. I think as humans, having the skill to approach somebody and say, tell me how you're experiencing this situation that we think might be charged by race. So let's talk about what happened. Let's talk about the killing of Black churchgoers. Let's talk about, racialized police activity. You could approach somebody. Let's talk about something positive that happens, like Coco Gauff winning the U.S. Open. You could approach somebody and say, how do you feel about Coco winning? If you approached me as somebody who played tennis in high school and as a Black woman, I'm going to tell you I think it's extraordinary. I'm going to talk about Serena and Venus. I'm going to talk about all the things that happened. I'm going to talk about my experience as a Black woman. Just that opening gives me all kinds of avenues to not only answer your question, but build relationship with you. And so if we can go to how questions, if you can go to I wonder questions, if you can go to tell me about questions.
So, and what do we do with the Jewish geography DNA that we've, so many of us have been raised with, and you see it all the time, I'm sure, in Jewish spaces. People are trying to place each other.
That's right. That's right.
In a way, you're kind of telling us that by itself is kind of an old habit that maybe should die a little faster.
I would say it's an old habit that can evolve while we also recognize our human nature to be connected to others, to resonate with that which feels familiar, to seek people out who remind us of ourselves. It creates safety, it creates familiarity. It helped keep us alive when we were wandering the desert and we knew how to find our own community. In this contemporary moment, we have to both capitalize on the wisdom of that and recognize that it creates boundaries and barriers between people sometimes and doesn't create bridges and connections.
So for those who say, where were the Jews of color when I was growing up in my synagogue?
Yeah.
How do you answer that?
I love that question because I wonder that same question too. And so we have to ask ourselves, where are people of color in a context that's designed to separate us in general? Because it's not about where were the people of color growing up in synagogue. It's like, why didn't I have any friends who were not like me? Why did I socialize in environments that reflected my own racial identity? Why was I not exposed to other people based on my social class, my social mores and values, my religious denomination and pathways? I didn't know to wonder about where more people of color were growing up because I was not told or reflected back to me who was in my own community. And so where were we? We were not reflected back. If you read Dr. Laura Liebman's book, We Once Were Slaves, she chronicles Jews of color in the United States in the late 17 and 1800s. About 10% of the U.S. Jewish community were people of color at that time. Jews of color have always been in the United States. And so we have to wonder what happened in our own Jewish community that separated us from ourselves and each other.
You've talked a lot about the post-George Floyd killing, the wake-up call of this country, actually internationally, where every institution, every community had to do some very hard introspection and kind of atonement and repentance and tshuva of some kind. And that in some ways we could say it's all a little too late. But in terms of particularly the Jewish community and your work, have you seen that wake-up call pay important dividends right now in terms of change? Or have we already sort of gotten beyond the kind of shock therapy of that moment?
I think it's a powerful question. And I think it also draws us to wonder, how do we evaluate change and the rate of change? I think that the murder of George Floyd and the killing of a number of unarmed Black and brown folks in this country created a wake-up call to do a couple of things. One, invite the Jewish community and our leadership to wonder, what are the experiences of Jewish people of color? And in what ways does our Judaism interact with some of the negative effects of race and racism in the United States? We got to wonder that question, and we started to create a lot of dialogue and a lot of community action and policies around that. So we've seen policies in Jewish organizations that talk about racism. We've seen opportunities to hold community members accountable in ways that are about repair and relationship when we have racist microaggressions or racist things happen. But if we look at the Jewish community and we look at the power of having leadership be reflective of our community membership, if you will, we've got some ways to go and some distance there, because every Jewish person deserves the opportunity to look out and see a reflection of themselves, maybe an older version of ourselves, to inspire us to who we will continue to be. We've had that physics for 5,000 years, where we've been able to look out, and everybody in this community deserves the opportunity to look out and see a reflection of ourselves. When we do that better, there will be more rabbis of color. There will be more CEOs of color. There'll be more cantors of color. There'll be more Jewish educators in the classroom talking about the history of color. That's good for everybody, and that's going to help sustain our Jewish community.
So as you know, my rabbi is a Jew of color, Angela Buchdahl at Central Synagogue, and she's talked quite publicly about the pain of being asked again and again, how are you a Jew? How are you Jewish? Did you convert? The redundancy of those questions that are seemingly just curious and innocent begin to sort of have a groove, a scarring. There are some who would say, what is the harm of being motivated by pure curiosity? I look at you, Ilana, and I wonder how you're a Jew, right? Can you help those who say, what did I do wrong? When I just asked that question? But I can imagine that if you're asked, and as Angela has said to me, Rabbi Buchdahl has said to me, you have to imagine I'm not getting asked once. I'm getting asked 100 times, hundreds of times. Now, obviously, she's a public figure, but can you kind of help? And again, I don't expect you to be pastoral and holding our hands, but this seems to be a mistake that many of us fall into.
I love your question, and I think it invites at least two things. One is, anytime we have the impulse to wonder how somebody became one of us, it's a signal to us that we lack the historical knowledge to make that connection. When we pause and think for just a second, of course, Jewish people were not white when Jews came of the Middle East, when Jews came out of Africa, because that's just not phenotypically possible. And so that's the first thing, is when we have that wonder emerge, we need to ask ourselves, wait a minute, I'm missing some information. The other thing that's happening is it means I want to feel connected to this person that I'm having this conversation with. And the curiosity is actually a signal or a flag for connection. And when we try to build connection, it's a mutual and relational dynamic. When we try to ask something to sate our curiosity, it's a transactional and a bit selfish dynamic. And so if we can move from that instinct, and if we can get in touch with our instinct around kind of satisfying our curiosity, which is a one-way opportunity, and move to trying to build a relationship and connection, it will inspire us to reframe those questions. And once we have the skill to reframe those questions, we move into creating connection and not just feeding our own satisfaction and curiosity.
That's a great point. I'm sure many people say, tell us how to improve. If one is coming from the standpoint of being a JCC, a synagogue, a federation organization, where you mentioned leadership and the paucity of Jews of color, where can these institutions, these sort of tent poles of our Jewish landscape do better?
I think, first of all, we need to have a rigorous and honest conversation with ourselves about the cost of not grappling directly with racism inside of the Jewish community, and thinking about the cost of what will happen when 30% of this community are people of color, 40% of this community are people of color, yet there's no reflections, no role models, no structures in place to have the capacity to be diverse. This is not about creating a dynamic where we just want to be more welcoming or we just want to be inclusive. We want a community infrastructure that recognizes, at least in the United States, there's a very potent kind of racism that is real. That racism affects everybody, including people of color and white folks in this country, negatively affects us all. And that as a multiracial community, we have to be better than the racist dynamics of the United States. So first of all, it's just about having a rigorous and honest conversation and owning that space. Next, we set goals. By 2025, by 2030, by 2032, we aspire to have a ratio balanced representation. So we need to put some goals and aspirations out there. This is a community that knows how to do rigorous work. And so once we have goals and outcomes, we can work ourselves backwards and come up with a plan. The last piece I want to say is this, two things. One, talking about letting go of power is really very touchy for all of us. And so in these conversations, when we talk about moving into spaces of more diverse leadership, it does mean that some people will not be leaders anymore. It does mean at some point the diversity of leadership will look different and change. That's a good thing. And those transitions are clunky and hard. And we need to make space for the clunky and hard part. The last piece is we know that over the arc of time, a majority of our families in this community are going to be multiracial. It doesn't mean we're going to be all people of color anytime soon. But, the way I like to think about it is most of us are just a niece or a nephew or a baby cousin or a grandbaby away from being a multiracial Jewish family. We need to think about those babies coming. We need to think about our young people, and we want every Jewish child to walk into their religious school experience or their day school experience or their camp experience and feel seen, validated, known, and that the adults supporting them have the skills and tools to keep them whole and safe. Because those are our future EDs, our future camp directors, our future JFN leaders.
So I want to go to well, you touched on it, and I think it's one of the hardest areas for Jews who have considered themselves adhering to the Passover mantra of welcoming the stranger and the Jewish tenet of B'Tselem Elohim, the belief that everyone is made in the image of God, that you don't put a stumbling block before the blind. I don't have to recite the litany of quote unquote Jewish values and ethics, and that they are very much in conflict with an idea that we're racist.
Right.
And the broad stroke that we are all culpable is a hard pill to swallow. Can you address that resistance, that sort of almost impulsive sense? It's not me. You're actually painting me with a brush without knowing
That's right.
what I've done in my life, where I've contributed, what my friendships are, where I've, stood up.
That's right.
And I'm not speaking as Abby.
No. It is so easy to feel like our work, our righteous, justice, deeply Jewish valued work is diminished when we also have to own the harm that is caused by our power and our privilege, particularly that which is unearned. Being able to reconcile those two things is a painful reality. And for most folks who have white skin privilege in the United States, just by virtue of that perception of race, one is afforded a certain set of benefits that people of color just don't have. And so I think one of the first things we can do is own the history and kind of the power and the policy reality without immediately taking it personally. And that's very, very hard. But because to say I benefit from racist policies, but I don't feel like a racist is a very hard set of ideas to hold. Number two, we need to acknowledge that with the perception of white skin privilege comes real policies and benefits from policies. We've seen that in housing. We've seen it in the opportunities to attend a fine college or university. We've seen it in who's been able to get housing and home loans. So this is all very real and the history is real. So what's the powerful way that a person with white skin privilege and who I might identify with whiteness, what's the powerful way to own that history and say, as a Jew, my work is to be righteous around it. Embracing our responsibility around racism is one of the most Jewish things we can do. And then struggling for the sake of heaven, getting together as a community and figuring out how we're going to navigate this together, complete with the pain and the challenge, is what happens when this community evolves and moves forward. And we have tradition for that. We know how to together struggle and wrestle for the sake of heaven, for example. The last piece I would say is this. One of the ways I like to view Torah, not to get too into the text, but in some ways I view it as a manual for us developing as Jews over time. And the way I think about it as a manual is I read the Tanakh, I read the Torah, and we get these do-overs over and over and over again about how to count our people, how to become a tribe, how to respond when God is angry or giving us something divine. And we make lots of mistakes as Jews. And then right there in the text is some instruction to do it again in a better way, in a different way on behalf of the Jewish people. So the last piece I want to say is we actually have a tradition of do-overs, not because we deserve to do it over and over and over again. We actually are required to develop the capacity to inquire about what went well and what didn't, to reflect on the things that we messed up on, and to let it go and apply our learnings. So responding to racism in a rigorous way is about one of the most Jewish things I think we can do.
It's hard to talk about Jewish racism without talking also about anti-Semitism in the Black community. And I'm wondering how the Jews of Color Initiative addresses that problem as well.
I think it's a really important question because we're both talking about racism and we're talking about anti-Semitism. And in some ways, Jews of color are a potent group that experience all of it on a daily basis. A couple of things. At the Jews of Color Initiative, and particularly for our team, we understand that while there might be an impulse to sort of point our finger at communities of color who are stereotyped as being more anti-Semitic than other groups, there's both some reality to some of that data, and there's an opportunity to do bridge building and education. So that's, first of all, how we view the question of anti-Semitism coming from communities of color. The second piece is we are in service to all Jews, and in some ways, all people of color around this question of anti-Semitism and also racism. And so we are in deep conversation with sometimes our Congress people, sometimes with professional athletes, sometimes with media personalities who are struggling at the intersection of understanding the history of Jews and Judaism, understanding the history of anti-Semitism in this country, and intersecting it with their experiences as people of color. And so we serve as an educational division, if you will. And the last piece I want to say about that is we also are here to advocate for the Jewish people and for the safety of the Jewish people. And so when we are invited into complex conversations around anti-Semitism that are expressed by powerful people of color in this country, we will name that our work is to support Jews and Jews of color. And when anti-Semitism is real, we will name it. We will help them understand the roots of how they came into relationship with the anti-Semitic content, for example, or the anti-Semitic idea, and help them understand, are they anti-Semitic or are they underinformed? And using their platform to espouse uninformed perspectives and ideas, and then we help them see the harm in it. The last thing I'm going to offer is, in one case, we also help them learn about the structure of a formal repair, a formal tshuva. And we sometimes will teach about the traditional structured approach to making a traditional Jewish repair, talk about the power of owning behavior in a public and transparent way, and the physics of community and connection that come from that moment inside of tshuva, inside of repair. And we help our colleagues understand that only in our actions of repair does that moment of connection get made. And you can talk about how you're not an anti-Semite, or you can talk about how what you did was not anti-Semitic, or you didn't mean it. But until you create that moment of repair, the physics of change and connection can't happen. And it's very important to focus on the change and connection.
Ilana Kaufman, thank you so much for this time. If some listeners, and I'm sure many will, would like to get involved or support the work you're doing, can you just give us the website, and we'll put it on the screen for Jews of Color Initiative?
First of all, thank you so much for having me. It has been my privilege and my pleasure. And please visit us at www.jewsofcolorinitiative.org.
Great. Thank you so much for being with us on In the Spotlight. I'm Abigail Pogrebin, and I'll see you next time.